Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow, as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften, like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. He started his night shift the same way he always did, by checking the perimeter, walking the same path he had walked hundreds of times before. The ground was damp from earlier rain, and the air carried that quiet, salty smell that only came from being close to the water. Most people were already home by this hour. Lights on, doors locked. Even the city seemed to lower its voice at night. He didn't mind working when no one was around. In some ways, it suited him. There was less to prove, less to perform. He passed a low fence and paused near the edge of the lot, where he could see the faint outline of the ocean beyond the structures. Far out in the distance, a lighthouse turned slowly, its beams sweeping across the dark with calm precision. The light didn't rush. It didn't blink for attention. It simply did its job again and again without checking who was watching. He leaned against the rail and watched it for a moment. There were nights when he wondered if his own work mattered. Security guard wasn't the kind of job people asked questions about with interest. It didn't sound impressive at dinner tables. When someone asked what he did, he usually answered quickly and moved on. Still, he showed up. Every shift, every weather, even on nights when his body felt heavy and his thoughts wandered too easily toward doubt. He checked his watch. Plenty of time left. As he continued walking, his footsteps echoed softly, steady and unremarkable. He thought about how often he measured his value by response, by praise, by someone noticing. When no one commented, no one thanked him, he sometimes felt invisible. But the lighthouse didn't seem to struggle with that question. It wasn't waiting for applause from passing ships. It didn't dim itself when the sea was empty. It shone because that was its role. That thought stayed with him as he finished his round and returned to his post. He sat down, pulled his jacket closer, and let the night settle around him. The wind moved through the open space, carrying the sound of waves breaking somewhere beyond sight. The lighthouse beam crossed the water again, briefly lighting the surface before moving on. He realized something quietly. Purpose didn't need an audience, and maybe neither did he. He sat there breathing evenly, letting the thought land without forcing it to mean more than it needed to. The night continued. The light kept turning. And for now, that was enough. Later in the shift, the temperature dropped slightly, the kind of change you felt more in your bones than on your skin. He stood up and stretched, rolling his shoulders, then walked back toward the railing where the view opened up again. The lighthouse was still there. Its beam moved in the same slow rhythm, unbothered by the passing hours, tracing a circle that never rushed and never hesitated. Watching it, he noticed how steady it was, how little it seemed to care about whether anyone was counting its turns. He thought about how different that was from the way he lived. So much of his energy went into checking reactions, reading rooms, wondering if what he did mattered enough to be seen. Even kindness sometimes felt like it needed proof. He had held doors open, covered extra shifts, listened when people needed to talk, and then quietly wondered afterward if any of it made a difference. If no one mentioned it, the doubt crept in. The lighthouse offered a simpler answer. It didn't ask the sea if it was useful tonight. It didn't adjust its light based on traffic. It simply stayed on. That realization settled in him slowly, like warmth spreading rather than a sudden flash of clarity. He wasn't meant to shine for recognition. He was meant to show up because it was his responsibility, his choice, his way of contributing to the world as it was, and that was already enough. He returned to his chair and sat down, hands resting loosely on his knees. The radio beside him remained silent, its faint static barely noticeable. For once, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt complete. He thought about tomorrow, about the small routines that would fill the hour's coffee keys, the familiar walk to his post. None of it felt heavy anymore. He understood now that worth wasn't something handed out by passing ships. It was something steady, built through presence, through consistency, through staying lit even when no one looked your way. The beam crossed the water again. He breathed out slowly. The night moved on, and he moved with it, grounded in the simple truth that doing what you are meant to do, with care and without demand, is its own kind of light. Fear can be loud, but it's rarely original. Most of the time, it's a shape made from something small, stretched across a wall by bad lighting and a tired mind. It was late evening, not fully night yet. The house was quiet in that uneven way it gets. When a day has finally slowed down, but hasn't fully settled. A person stood just outside a child's bedroom doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame. The hallway light was on. Inside the room, a small nightlight glowed near the floor, casting a soft amber circle across the wall. The child was already asleep, breathing slow, even. One arm flung over the blanket, trusting the world, in a way adults tend to forget how to do. On the wall, shadows moved. They weren't dramatic, just shapes, long fingers stretching when someone shifted in the hallway, a curved form where a jacket hung on the back of a chair, something tall and uneven where a stack of books caught the light at the wrong angle. Ordinary things doing ordinary shadow things. Still, the person paused. They felt that familiar tightening in the chest, the quick mental scan, the subtle urge to step fully into the room and check everything, even though everything had already been checked. The door was locked. The windows were closed. The house was safe. They knew this. And yet, fear doesn't always come from danger. Sometimes it comes from imagination filling in the gaps where understanding has gone quiet. They leaned their head gently against the doorframe and watched the wall a little longer. The shadows shifted again as the HVAC turned on warm air, moving through the vents with a soft rush. The light flickered slightly, then steadied. Nothing had changed. And yet, the shapes looked different. It reminded them of something from childhood. Lying awake, staring at the ceiling, convinced that the dark corners of the room were hiding something alive. Something watching, something waiting. Back then, fear had felt enormous, real enough to sit up with, and what had always fixed it wasn't bravery. It was light. A lamp switched on, a parent's voice, a hand waving across the wall, turning monsters into fingers. The memory settled in quietly. They stepped into the room and adjusted the nightlight, turning it just a little so the glow spread more evenly. The shadows softened instantly. The sharp edges disappeared. The wall looked blank again, almost boring. Nothing dramatic had happened. No threat removed. Just a small change in angle. They stood there, noticing how easily the fear had dissolved. How little effort it took once the light was right. That's when a thought surfaced, gentle but clear. What if some of the fears they carry now are like this, not dangers but distortions, not warnings but misunderstandings? Lately, fear had been showing up in subtle ways. Not panic attacks, not sleepless nights. More like a steady sense that something was wrong, even when nothing obvious was. Worry about the future, about making the wrong choice, about missing something important and realizing it too late. The fear didn't scream, it whispered. It showed up as mental images, scenes that hadn't happened yet playing out with certainty. Conversations that ended badly. Decisions that led to regret. A life that slowly narrowed instead of opening. All shadows. All convincing. They reached out and gently pulled the blanket higher around the sleeping child's shoulders. The child shifted once, then settled again, unaffected by any of it. That felt important. Fear was very active in the adult mind, but completely absent here. Not because the world was different, but because perception was. They turned to leave the room, then stopped. One last glance at the wall. No shadows now. Just paint, just stillness. In the hallway, the light buzzed faintly. They flipped it off and let the house fall into deeper quiet. The kitchen beyond was dim, illuminated only by the glow of the clock on the microwave. Blue numbers, steady, unconcerned. They stood there longer than necessary, listening to the low sounds of the house doing what houses do, settling, adjusting, holding. Fear tried again, softer now. What if you're missing something? They didn't answer the question. They just noticed it. Not everything that appears in the mind is asking to be believed. Some things are just shadows. They moved into the living room and sat on the couch, the cushions dipping familiarly beneath their weight. The room was darker here, but not threatening. Familiar darkness has a different quality. It doesn't ask for explanations. They looked around and noticed how the shapes of furniture blended into one another. How the mind, given enough darkness, always tries to define edges, to name forms, to create stories. It's trying to help. It's just not very good at this part. They leaned back and exhaled, slow and unforced. The fear that had felt sharp earlier now felt thin, still present but less convincing. Like a movie you've already seen once, you can still watch it, but it doesn't have the same grip. They thought again of the wall in the bedroom, of how quickly everything changed when the light shifted. Maybe understanding works the same way. Not forcing fear away, not arguing with it, just bringing a little awareness into the room. They sat there quietly, letting that idea settle without turning it into a rule or a plan. The house stayed still. The night stayed ordinary. And somewhere between the shadows and the light, fear lost some of its shape. The couch held their weight without complaint. The room didn't ask for anything. Outside, a car passed, headlights briefly sliding across the ceiling before disappearing. The darkness returned unchanged. They stayed where they were, letting the mind do what it tends to do when it's finally given space. Thoughts rose, drifted, faded. None of them urgent. None of them demanding action. Fear appeared again, but it came dressed as concern. You should be more prepared. You should think this through again. It sounded responsible, almost caring. They noticed how fear often borrows the language of wisdom, how easily it disguises itself as foresight or caution, and how when you look closely, it's usually repeating the same few images over and over, just changing the lighting. They remembered the child's room. The shapes on the wall hadn't disappeared because someone fought them. They disappeared because they were understood. Understanding didn't make the room brighter. It just made the shadows honest. That thought stayed with them. They stood up and walked toward the kitchen, bare feet quiet on the floor. The clock numbers on the microwave hadn't changed much. Time was moving, but it wasn't in a hurry. They poured a glass of water and drank slowly, feeling the coolness move through their body. Simple sensations have a way of pulling attention out of imagined futures and back into what's actually happening. Fear doesn't like that. Fear prefers abstraction. It prefers what if to what is. They leaned against the counter and looked out the window. The yard was dark. The outlines of trees blended into the night sky. Somewhere leaves rustled. Probably wind. Probably nothing that required interpretation. And that too felt important. So many fears survive because they're never checked against reality. They live in half-seen shapes and incomplete information. They feel real because they've never been looked at directly. They thought about the worries that had been looping lately, about decisions that felt heavy, about uncertainty that refused to resolve, about the constant sense that they were supposed to know more than they did. Those worries had felt large because they were being projected onto a blank wall of the future, like shadows. What if the future isn't dangerous, just dimly lit? That question didn't come with an answer. It didn't need one. It simply shifted the stance from fear to curiosity. They set the glass down and turned off the kitchen light. The room darkened instantly, but it didn't feel threatening. The shapes were familiar now. The mind didn't rush to invent stories about them. They walked back toward the bedroom and paused once more at the doorway. The child hadn't moved. The nightlight cast a steady glow. No shadows had returned. Everything was still. They realized then that fear often asks for certainty, when what it really wants is reassurance, and reassurance doesn't always come from guarantees. Sometimes it comes from recognition, from seeing what something truly is. A jacket isn't a monster. A thought isn't a prophecy. A feeling isn't a verdict. They closed the door gently and moved down the hallway, turning off the last light. The house settled fully into night. In the bedroom, they lay down and pulled the blanket up, feeling its weight press them into the mattress. The body relaxed in small increments, as if releasing tension it hadn't known it was holding. Fear didn't disappear completely. It probably wouldn't. But it no longer dominated the room. It had been reduced to what it actually was, a signal, not a command. A shadow, not a thing. They let their eyes close. Understanding had done its quiet work, not by changing the world, but by changing how it was seen. The night continued calm and ordinary, and in that ordinary darkness, there was nothing to fear. Some grudges don't feel dramatic. They feel reasonable, like something you've earned the right to carry. They sit quietly in the background of your day, flavoring everything just a little. Conversations taste sharper. Silence tastes bitter. Nothing is unbearable, but nothing is clean either. That evening, she was at a laundromat a few blocks from home, the kind that stayed open late and smelled faintly of detergent and warm metal. Rows of machines thumped and turned in steady rhythm. A TV bolted to the wall played a muted game show no one was really watching. The fluorescent lights were bright but tired. She slid coins into a washer and pushed the door closed with her hip. The machine started with a low churn water rushing in like it always did. She sat down on a hard plastic chair and set her bag at her feet. This wasn't where she planned to be tonight. But her apartment washer had broken again, and she didn't have the patience to deal with it. The day had already asked too much. Earlier, there had been a call. Short, familiar. A voice on the other end that knew exactly how to press the old buttons without raising its own volume. Nothing outright cruel, just dismissive enough. Enough to remind her of how often she'd been expected to understand, to bend to be the bigger person. She'd hung up politely. She always did. Now sitting there, the anger came back in waves. Not sharp, but salty. like something she'd been sipping from all day without realizing how much it was dehydrating her. She leaned back and watched the washer spin. Clothes slapped gently against the drum, socks, shirts, a towel she'd owned for years. Ordinary things going around and around, over and over, until they came out clean. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't check it. She already knew who it would be. Or maybe not who, but what. Another message. Another attempt to smooth things over without actually changing anything. She crossed her arms and felt the familiar tightening in her chest. It wasn't just about tonight. It never was. It was about the accumulation. The way small hurts stacked up until they felt heavy. On the vending machine near the door, a plastic bottle of water reflected the harsh light. She stood, walked over, fed in a few coins, and twisted the cap off. The water was cold, almost painfully so. She took a long drink. It tasted off. Not bad exactly. Just wrong. She frowned and took another sip. Same thing. A faint bitterness she couldn't place. She looked at the bottle, then at her hand. There was salt on her fingers, left over from a soft pretzel she'd grabbed earlier without thinking. She'd wiped her hand on a napkin, but not enough. The salt had transferred to the bottle's mouth. She laughed quietly at herself. A small sound quickly swallowed by the machines. One pinch of salt didn't seem like much, but in a small bottle it changed everything. She rinsed the bottle cap at the sink and drank again. This time the water tasted clean, neutral, what it was supposed to be. She stood there a moment longer, letting that register, not as a lesson, not as advice, but as a simple fact. Some things only stay bitter because you keep them in a small container. She went back to her chair and watched the washer finish its cycle. The machine slowed, then stopped with a final dull thud. She moved her clothes to the dryer, poured in detergent, closed the door. Another rhythm began. Thump. Pause. Thump. The anger in her chest shifted. It didn't disappear, but it spread out. It felt less concentrated, less sharp. She thought about the call again, but this time without rehearsing what she should have said. She thought about it like it was just one drop in a much bigger body of water. Important, yes, but not the whole story of her life. Forgiveness didn't feel close. That word still felt like something she wasn't ready to touch. But something else felt possible, not carrying this one moment so tightly. She imagined holding the resentment like a small fistful of salt. Powerful in the palm, sharp on the tongue, useful in the right amount, but punishing when kept close. She didn't need to throw it away tonight. She didn't need to pretend it didn't exist. She just needed to stop drinking from it. The dryer hummed on. The TV flickered. Someone laughed softly on the other side of the room. Life continued unbothered by the tight story she'd been telling herself. She took another sip of water. Clean, simple. And for the first time that evening, her shoulders dropped without being told. She folded her clothes slowly, one piece at a time, as the dryer finished its last lazy turn. The warmth clung to the fabric, familiar and grounding. A shirt, a towel, a pair of socks that never quite stayed together. ordinary things warm in her hands, asking for nothing more than to be put away. The laundromat had grown quieter. One machine stopped, another started. Somewhere near the door, someone yawned without trying to hide it. The TV was still on, but no one was watching anymore. She stacked the folded clothes neatly in her basket and sat for a moment before standing. The anger was still there, but now it felt diluted, like it had been spread across a wider space instead of sitting heavy in one tight spot. On the drive home, she noticed how her thoughts kept trying to return to the call, the familiar pull. The urge to replay it, polish it, squeeze meaning out of every word. Each time it surfaced, she didn't push it away. She just let it widen the way water widens when it meets something larger. By the time she parked, the street was quiet. Porch lights glowed softly. A dog barked once, then settled. She carried the laundry inside and set it down without rushing to put everything away. In the kitchen, she poured herself another glass of water. This time she rinsed her hands first without thinking. The glass was clean. The water tasted like nothing at all, and that nothing felt like relief. She leaned against the counter and drank it slowly. Her body responded before her thoughts did. A small sigh, a release she hadn't planned. She thought again about the person on the other end of the phone call. Not with tenderness, not with blame either, just with distance. Enough distance to see that whatever they carried, whatever they were repeating, didn't need to become her entire inner climate. It struck her then how often resentment behaves like a solution. How it promises protection, control, clarity. But what it really does when held too close is shrink the space you live in. Everything starts to taste the same. Sharp, overbearing, too much. She didn't need to forgive tonight. She didn't need to call anyone back or write a careful message. She just needed to notice the size of the container she was holding this feeling in. She imagined the resentment again as salt. In a small glass, it ruined the water. But poured into a lake, it disappeared. Not because it was denied, but because it wasn't concentrated anymore. Her life was bigger than this moment, bigger than this call, bigger than the pattern she was tired of. That thought didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical. She carried the basket to the bedroom and set it at the foot of the bed. Instead of folding everything right away, she lay back for a moment, still dressed lights low. The ceiling fan turned slowly above her, slicing the air into gentle pieces. Her phone rested on the nightstand. It stayed quiet. She didn't check for messages. She didn't brace for them either. She let the space exist as it was, unanswered, open. Forgiveness, she realized, didn't always arrive as a feeling towards someone else. Sometimes it arrived as restraint toward yourself, as the choice not to keep pouring bitterness into a small cup and calling it strength. She turned onto her side and listened to the soft mechanical rhythm of the fan. Her breath matched it without effort. The anger hadn't vanished, but it no longer dominated the room. It was just one element among many, like salt in the air near the ocean. Present, but not overwhelming. Tomorrow she might speak up, or she might set a boundary. Or she might decide that some conversations didn't deserve the same energy anymore. All of those options were still available. Tonight she didn't need to solve it. She closed her eyes and let the quiet do its work. The water inside her felt clean again. Some fears don't come from what's actually happening. They come from what the mind repeats. That night, the person was walking through a long parking garage beneath an apartment building. The concrete walls were bare, marked only by faded numbers and old tire streaks. The lighting was dim but steady, and every sound carried farther than expected. Footsteps echoed. A keychain jingled. Even a quiet breath seemed louder than usual. The person slowed without realizing it. The body reacted before the mind had time to explain why. A slight tightening in the chest, a subtle alertness in the shoulders. Nothing was wrong, but the space made it feel like something might be. The mind filled in the rest. Did you hear that? What if someone's behind you? Why does this place always feel unsettling? The person paused near a concrete pillar and glanced around. Empty. Still. Just rows of parked cars and long shadows stretching across the floor. A car door slammed somewhere above. The sound dropped down through the open levels, bouncing and returning in fragments. The person felt a brief spike of tension, then a quiet embarrassment at their own reaction. It was just an echo. But the body didn't know that immediately. It had already responded to the sound, treating it as a signal. The person continued walking footsteps, measured now, listening more carefully. Each step produced a familiar pattern. The sound went out, hit the walls, and came back slightly altered. Louder, longer, less precise. The mind noticed this and began to anticipate it. Every movement seemed to generate another response. Overthinking often works the same way. A thought appears, the mind reacts to it, then reacts again to its own reaction. Soon the original trigger is gone, but the noise remains. The person stopped and deliberately shuffled one foot across the concrete. The sound scraped loudly, then returned in layers. The person waited. No new sound followed. Silence returned quickly. That felt important, though the person didn't rush to define why. Walking again, the person remembered other moments like this. Times when a single comment lingered for hours. When one small mistake seemed to echo through an entire day. When fear multiplied simply because it had space to bounce around. The garage wasn't dangerous. It was just open. And open spaces amplify sound. The person reached the car and unlocked it. The beep echoed sharply, bouncing off the walls. For a split second, the body flinched again. Then the person smiled slightly at the familiarity of the reaction. Even expected sounds can startle when the environment is right. Inside the car, the door closed with a solid thud. The space became smaller, contained. The echoes stopped. The person sat there for a moment before starting the engine, noticing how quickly the body settled once the noise had nowhere to go. Breathing slowed. Shoulders softened. The mind followed. It wasn't that the fear had been unreasonable. It had just been amplified, reflected, repeated. The engine started. Its low hum filled the space, steady and predictable. As the car moved toward the exit, the sound of tires on concrete created another echo. But this one felt different, familiar, controlled. Overthinking often convinces us that the noise in our head is proof of danger. But much of it is just reflection thoughts, bouncing off other thoughts, growing louder each time they return. The person drove slowly up the ramp, passing level after level. With each turn, the echoes shifted, then faded. The open space behind grew distant. Outside, the night air felt different, wider, softer. Sounds didn't cling the same way. The person pulled into the street and let the car coast for a moment, windows slightly open. A breeze passed through, carrying the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood, distant traffic. A dog barking far away, someone laughing on a balcony. None of it echoed. The mind noticed the contrast. How fear had filled the garage, not because it was real, but because it had room to repeat itself. The person didn't make a promise to stop worrying. That would have been another echo. Instead, there was a simple awareness settling in. Not every loud thought comes from something solid. Some of them are just returning sounds. And for now, that understanding was enough to keep moving. Later that night, the person noticed how the garage stayed in the body longer than expected. Not as fear exactly, more like a residue, a slight readiness, a habit of listening too closely. At home, lights were dim, shoes were set by the door. The quiet here was different from the quiet underground. It didn't bounce, it settled. Still, the mind brought things back. That sound earlier, that pause, that moment of tension. The thoughts arrived clearly, as if they were still traveling through open space, waiting to return. The person sat down on the couch and let them come without pushing them away. They didn't feel dangerous now, just loud. Overthinking often survives on repetition. A thought doesn't need to be true to be convincing. It only needs to be heard enough times. In an open mental space, it can keep returning each time, sounding more important than the last. The person leaned back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The sound was steady. It didn't echo. It stayed where it was. That difference stood out. The garage hadn't created the fear. It had just amplified it. The mind does the same thing when it's tired. When it's given too much space and not enough grounding, every worry travels farther than it needs to. One thought calls out. Another answers. Soon it feels like a conversation, even though it's just one voice hearing itself. The person tried a small experiment. They cleared their throat softly. The sound stayed close, no return. A quiet understanding followed, not as a conclusion, but as a sensation. Maybe the fear earlier hadn't been a warning. Maybe it had been a reflection. A memory surfaced from years ago, standing in a canyon during a trip. Someone had shouted just to hear the sound come back. The echo had been thrilling then, surprising, harmless. No one assumed danger. Everyone understood what it was. But in the dark garage, the same effect had felt threatening. Context mattered. The person thought about how often the mind forgets context. How a tired thought at night feels heavier than the same thought in the morning. How silence can turn small worries into loud ones when there's nothing else to absorb them. The couch creaked slightly as the person shifted position. The sound didn't return. The room held it gently. There was no need to force calm, no need to silence the mind. Just noticing where the noise was coming from changed how it landed. The worries from earlier in the day tried to reappear, unfinished conversations. Imagined misunderstandings, possible outcomes that hadn't happened yet. They showed up with the same shape they always had. But now they felt flatter, less three-dimensional, like echoes without a source. The person imagined calling out again inside that garage. Imagined the sound traveling, bouncing, returning. And then imagined simply not calling out at all. The silence that would follow wasn't empty. It was neutral. That felt important. You don't have to answer every echo. You don't have to respond to every thought that comes back louder than it left. Some thoughts only exist because they keep being answered. The person stood up and walked toward the kitchen, bare feet quiet on the floor. A glass was filled with water. The faucet turned off cleanly. The sound stopped exactly where it should. The body relaxed a little more. The garage would still be there tomorrow. The echoes would still happen if someone walked through it again. Nothing about that needed to be fixed or avoided. What had changed was the understanding of what an echo actually is. Not a warning, not a message, just sound returning in an open space. The mind too has spaces like that. Wide, hollow areas where thoughts bounce around when nothing else is present. Filling those spaces doesn't require more thinking. Sometimes it just requires contact with the body, with the room, with something solid and near. The person finished the water and set the glass down. The sound was soft, final. It didn't come back. For the rest of the evening, thoughts still appeared. But when they grew loud, the person recognized the pattern. This feels like an echo. And without effort, without argument, the sound faded on its own. The cave had never been dangerous. It had just been empty. And now, there was enough here to keep the noise from returning. She stayed a few minutes after closing, even though no one asked her to. The clinic was quiet now, the kind of quiet that came after a long day of voices, instructions, and small talk that required constant attention. She moved through the rooms, slowly gathering trays and placing used tools into the metal basin by the sink. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. She turned on the water. It flowed over the instruments in a thin, steady stream, washing away what the day had left behind. She watched it for a moment, letting the rhythm pull her out of her thoughts. There was a faint ache behind her eyes. Not a headache exactly, more like emotional fatigue settling in. As she sorted the tools, her mind drifted back to a comment someone had made years ago. A sentence said casually, without much thought. It had landed harder than it should have. She didn't remember the exact words anymore. Only the feeling they left behind. Small, exposed. She had carried that feeling with her longer than she cared to admit. Even now it surfaced unexpectedly, usually when she was already tired. It showed up as self-doubt, as the quiet urge to over-explain, as the habit of apologizing before anyone asked. She lifted a pair of instruments and placed them carefully on the tray. Metal touched metal with a soft clink. She had tried many ways to get rid of that old hurt, ignoring it, outgrowing it, proving it wrong. None of it worked for long. The water continued to run, and she let her hands rest under it for a moment, warmth spreading across her palms. She remembered something she had once read about pearls, how they weren't created from comfort, but from irritation. A grain of sand entering the shell rubbing against something tender. The oyster didn't reject it. It couldn't. Instead, it responded the only way it knew how, by coating the irritation again and again, slowly, patiently, until the sharpness was no longer sharp. She looked down at her hands. How many times had she done the same thing, wrapped herself in competence, in politeness, in being useful? Layer by layer, she had protected the soft parts that felt too exposed to leave unguarded. She had always thought of those layers as armor, as something she needed because she was weak. Standing there now, she saw them differently. They weren't signs of failure. They were evidence of survival. The water cooled as she turned the handle slightly, bringing the stream down to a gentler flow. She breathed in and out slow and steady. The ache behind her eyes eased. She finished cleaning the last tray and set it aside to dry. The room felt lighter, even though nothing had changed. She turned off the sink. In the sudden quiet, she felt the old hurt still there, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a beginning. She dried her hands slowly and leaned back against the counter, letting her shoulders drop for the first time that day. The clinic was completely still now, as if it too was resting. She thought about how often she had judged herself for being sensitive, for remembering things others had forgotten, for carrying words longer than they were meant to be carried. She had told herself she needed thicker skin, that being affected meant something was wrong with her. But pearls didn't form in shells that felt nothing. They formed where something had been irritated, where the surface was soft enough to notice. That idea stayed with her as she turned off the lights and walked toward the exit. The hallway felt longer in the dim, but not uncomfortable. Outside, the evening air was cool and clean. She paused before getting into her car, hands resting on the door, and took a deep breath. She felt tired but not drained. She realized then that the old hurt hadn't weakened her. It had shaped the way she listened, the way she noticed when someone else felt uneasy, the way she chose her words carefully. These weren't flaws. They were layers she had built to protect something valuable. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to peel them away. She didn't have to heal by becoming harder or less affected. She could heal by being kinder to the part of herself that had learned how to cope. She started the car and pulled out of the lot, headlights cutting through the quiet street. The road ahead was familiar, unremarkable, and that felt comforting. As she drove, she let herself sit with the idea that maybe her sensitivity wasn't a problem to fix. Maybe it was the very thing that allowed something beautiful to form. Not because she chose the pain, but because she learned how to respond to it. When she reached home, she turned off the engine and sat for a moment longer than usual. No music, no phone, just stillness. She placed one hand over her chest, feeling her breath rise and fall beneath it. The hurt hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. And in that change, she felt something close to peace. Fear often announces itself loudly. It wants attention. It wants to be heard. It wants to convince you that whatever is making the most noise must also be the most important thing in the room. It was late afternoon when the storm rolled in earlier than expected. The sky darkened quickly, clouds stacking up in heavy layers, the light thinning out as if someone had turned a dimmer switch too fast. A person stood in the kitchen sleeves, rolled up, rinsing a mug that had already been clean. The radio was off. The house felt alert, waiting. Thunder cracked suddenly close enough to feel in the chest. The windows rattled. The sound was sharp, commanding, impossible to ignore. They froze for a second, hand still under the running water. The body reacts before the mind explains. A jolt of tension, a shallow inhale, the old instinct that says something's wrong. They turned off the faucet and listened. Rain followed, heavy drops striking the roof in quick succession, then settling into a steady rhythm. Another thunderclap came, louder than the first, stretching out longer, as if the sky were tearing something open. It felt like too much, too sudden. Lately, life had felt like this storm, loud signals everywhere. News alerts, emails with urgent subject lines, conversations that escalated faster than expected, worries that arrived fully formed, already shouting. The sense that if something is loud, it must be dangerous. If it's quiet, it must not matter. They moved away from the sink and leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely. Outside the window, the small yard blurred under the rain. Leaves shook, branches bent. Everything visible seemed to be reacting. Another crash of thunder hit, followed by a flicker of light. The power didn't go out, but the house dimmed for half a second, enough to make them tense again. Fear likes reinforcement. It builds its case through repetition, through volume, through interruption. They took a breath slower this time and noticed something they hadn't before. Beneath the thunder, beneath the rain, there was another sound. Softer, more consistent. Water moving through the gutters, rain tapping the ground. A low, steady hiss where drops met soil. The storm wasn't just noise, it was also nourishment. They knew this in a factual way, but they hadn't felt it yet. They stepped closer to the window and looked down toward the corner of the yard where a small patch of soil sat between concrete slabs. Nothing was planted there intentionally. No garden, no plan. Just dirt that collected leaves and whatever seeds happened to land. The thunder boomed again, and the ground outside darkened further as it soaked in the rain. The soil changed color quickly, drinking it in. They found themselves thinking about growth, about how often it's associated with effort, visibility, progress you can point to, and how rarely it's associated with quiet persistence. Thunder feels powerful because it demands attention. But nothing grows because of thunder. Growth happens lower, slower, out of sight. The thought didn't come as comfort, it came as correction. They had been measuring their own life by the wrong signals, by noise, by urgency, by moments of intensity. And when those moments weren't happening, fear filled the gap. Nothing's happening. You're falling behind. You should be further along. Another crack of thunder split the air, and the rain intensified for a moment, drumming hard against the roof. The sound filled the kitchen, leaving no space for subtlety. And yet outside, in that patch of soil, something else was happening. Something that didn't announce itself. Something that wouldn't be visible for days, maybe weeks. Seeds don't respond to noise. They respond to conditions. They need water. They need time. They need darkness. The person stayed by the window, watching the rain soak into the ground. Their shoulders lowered gradually, not because the storm had softened, but because something inside them had stopped reacting to it. They realized how often fear had pulled their attention toward the loudest part of experience, toward the argument, the crisis, the imagined worst-case outcome. How rarely they had trusted what was happening quietly in the background. The storm rumbled again, farther away this time. The sound had less edge to it now, more distance. They thought about all the times they'd mistaken silence for stagnation, all the times they'd assumed that because nothing dramatic was happening, nothing meaningful was. But life doesn't always speak in thunder. Sometimes it speaks in small shifts, in softened soil, in unseen roots pushing gently downward. They rested one hand on the counter and stayed there listening, not for the thunder this time, but for the rhythm beneath it. The rain. The steady, unremarkable work of water meeting earth. Fear was still present. The storm hadn't ended. The noise hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like the whole story. The storm stayed for a while, not rushing through, not apologizing. Thunder rolled at uneven intervals now, sometimes loud, sometimes distant, like it was slowly losing interest. The rain settled into a steadier pace, less dramatic, more patient. They remained by the window longer than expected. There was no reason to move. Nothing else needed doing. The kitchen felt suspended in this in-between state, neither tense nor fully relaxed, just attentive. The mind, with fewer sharp sounds to react to, began to wander in a different direction. They thought about how fear often trains attention upward and outward, toward headlines, toward raised voices, toward anything that signals urgency. It teaches you to scan for threat instead of noticing support. But the body knows another rhythm. As they stood there, they became aware of their feet against the floor. Cool tile, solid. The weight of their body distributed evenly, without effort. The quiet reassurance of gravity doing its work. Outside, the rain continued soaking into the ground. The soil no longer repelled it. It accepted it, darkened, softened. That image stayed. They imagined a seed down there, not a metaphorical one, just an ordinary seed. Small, unimpressive, carried by chance. It didn't respond to the thunder above. It didn't hurry because the sky was loud. It waited for the conditions that actually mattered. Moisture, warmth, time. Fear had been convincing them that progress should feel dramatic, that change should come with noise, that if something important were happening, they'd feel it intensely. But intensity isn't the same as significance. They'd lived long enough to know this intellectually. Still, fear has a way of making you forget what you already understand. Another low rumble passed through the sky farther away now. The storm was moving on, not ending suddenly, just drifting elsewhere. They noticed the quiet that followed each thunderclap, the pause where nothing happened. No damage, no consequence, just space. That pause felt generous. They realized then how often fear had collapsed time for them, how it made every loud moment feel permanent, how it whispered this will last forever when experience kept proving otherwise. Storms pass, so do seasons, so do the states of mind that feel overwhelming while you're inside them. They stepped back from the window and turned the kitchen light down a notch, softening the room. The house responded immediately, becoming warmer, less sharp. They moved to the table and sat, hands resting flat on the surface. The wood was cool, smooth, familiar. Another ordinary sensation anchoring them to the present. The storm had done its work, not by being impressive, but by bringing what was needed. The rest would happen quietly later, without witnesses. They thought about the parts of their life that felt dormant, the ideas that hadn't surfaced yet, the confidence that seemed to have gone underground, the sense of direction that felt delayed. Maybe none of it was gone. Maybe it was simply responding to a deeper cycle. Fear had been measuring life by thunder, by moments of disruption, pressure, noise. But growth had its own clock, one that didn't announce itself or check for approval. The rain lightened. The sound on the roof thinned to a gentle tapping, then to a hush. The gutters still carried water away, steady and unremarkable. Outside, the yard looked calmer now, washed clean. Nothing visibly different. And yet, everything had changed at the level that mattered. They sat there until the last rumble faded completely. When the storm finally moved on, it didn't leave silence behind. It left the quiet continuation of things. The refrigerator hum, the distant sound of a car driving over wet pavement, the house settling back into itself. Fear had lost its volume, not because it had been confronted or defeated, but because it had been seen in context. Loud, yes, but not in charge. They stood up, turned off the light, and let the kitchen rest in dimness. Tomorrow, they knew the patch of soil outside would look the same as it always did. No visible sprouts, no proof. And that was fine. Some of the strongest changes happen in silence beneath the surface, long before they ask to be noticed. Thunder may announce itself, but life grows quietly, and tonight, that was enough. He didn't think of the other person as an enemy. Not out loud anyway. He used softer words. Difficult, toxic, impossible. But in his body it felt the same, a tightness that showed up the second he saw their name. A heat that rose before he even chose it. That afternoon, he came home later than usual and didn't take his shoes off right away. He stood in the entryway with his keys still in his hand, staring at nothing. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that gives your mind room to start building a whole movie. He'd had a conversation earlier that didn't go well. It wasn't a screaming fight. It was worse in a way: controlled voices, polite language, and that cold, sharp feeling underneath. The kind of exchange where you walk away looking fine, but your chest stays tight for hours after. Now he sat in his living room with one lamp on and the rest of the lights off. The TV stayed dark. He didn't want noise. He didn't want distraction. He wanted something to make sense. On the coffee table was an empty chair across from him. Just a simple dining chair he'd pulled in earlier when he cleaned and never moved back. Nothing special about it. But tonight it stood out in the dim room like it had a purpose. He stared at it, and without meaning to, he started talking in his head. Not to the chair exactly. To the person he was angry with. He replayed the conversation. He corrected his own lines. He imagined better comebacks, stronger boundaries, cooler delivery. He imagined saying the one sentence that would finally make them understand. It never worked. The imaginary version of them never softened. They always had another excuse, another deflection, another way to make him feel like he was overreacting. Even in his own mind, he couldn't win. He stood up, walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and drank it too fast. The cold hit his throat and didn't fix anything. He leaned on the counter, jaw tight, and felt the anger in his body looking for a place to land. It would have been so easy to call them, or text, or send some final clear message that said, "I'm done." That's what anger wants sometimes. A clean cut, a dramatic release. A door slammed so loudly the whole house knows it happened. But he didn't want drama. He wanted peace, and peace felt far away. He went back to the living room and sat down again facing the empty chair. He didn't know why he kept looking at it. Maybe because the chair was simple. It didn't argue. It didn't twist his words. It didn't demand anything. It just sat there quiet. And then he remembered something a therapist had once said years ago in a session he'd almost forgotten. Sometimes imagine the person you're furious with as a child. Not to excuse them, just to see them. At the time, he'd rolled his eyes. It had sounded like therapy speak, like a trick. But now, staring at the empty chair, he tried it anyway. Not with enthusiasm, not with hope. Just as an experiment he didn't have to believe in. He pictured the person sitting there, but not as they were now. He pictured them much younger, small, maybe 7 or 8, legs not reaching the floor, swinging slightly. A kid in a hoodie that was a little too big. The kind of kid who had learned early how to act tough so no one would see how scared they were. The image wasn't clear. He didn't know their childhood story. He wasn't inventing a whole biography. He just held the simplest version, a small person with pain they didn't know how to handle. And to his surprise, the anger in his chest didn't get bigger. It hesitated. Not because he suddenly felt warm toward them. He didn't. But something shifted in the story. The story moved from they're evil to they're hurt. And hurt people don't always act in ways that make sense. Hurt people often act in ways that spread hurt. That didn't make it okay. It just made it less personal. He felt a small release in his shoulders, like a knot loosening. It was subtle, but it was real. He breathed out and realized he'd been holding his breath. He stared at the chair again and let the image stay there, this smaller version, sitting silently, not defending, not attacking, just existing. He thought, if that kid had been held better, would this adult still be like this? He didn't know. There was no answer. But the question itself softened something. He looked down at his hands. They were clenched without him noticing. He opened them slowly, fingers relaxing one by one, and rested them on his thighs. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about pretending they didn't cause harm. Maybe it was about refusing to keep carrying the harm in his own body, hour after hour, day after day. The chair stayed empty, of course. The room stayed quiet. But inside him, something had stopped sprinting. He stayed seated longer than he meant to. The room didn't change, but his body did. The heat that had been pushing against his ribs softened into something duller, heavier. Not gone, just quieter. Like a sound fading into the background once you stop listening for it. The image of the child in the chair lingered. Not vividly, more like a presence. A small shape that didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't justify anything. Just sat there, legs dangling, waiting. He noticed how different his breath felt now. Still not calm exactly, but deeper, less sharp. His chest wasn't braced the way it had been earlier, like it was preparing for impact that never came. He thought about how much effort anger takes, how it asks you to stay alert, to remember details, to keep score, how it demands your attention again and again, long after the moment has passed. Carrying it had started to feel like a second job. He stood up and walked to the window, resting his hand against the glass. Outside, the street was quiet. A porch light glowed a few houses down. Somewhere a dog barked once and stopped. The world didn't seem to be holding its breath the way he had been. When he turned back to the chair, the image shifted slightly. The child wasn't looking at him anymore, just staring at the floor, shoulders slightly hunched, like someone used to being misunderstood or not seen at all. He felt a brief ache in his chest. Not sympathy exactly, more like recognition. He knew that posture. He'd worn it himself once, years ago, in different rooms with different people. That realization didn't erase the harm that had been done. It didn't change the words that had been said or the way they had landed. But it did something quieter. It interrupted the story that said this pain needed to keep circulating forever. He realized then that he'd been confusing forgiveness with closeness, as if letting go meant reopening doors that had already proven unsafe, as if easing his grip meant inviting more damage. But forgiveness, at least the kind he could live with, didn't require any of that. It didn't ask him to call. It didn't ask him to explain. It didn't ask him to reconcile. It only asked him to stop letting this person live rent-free inside his body. He walked back to the couch and sat down again, this time not directly facing the chair, just beside it. The child image faded on its own like a daydream losing focus, when you stopped feeding it. What remained was a simple truth he hadn't allowed himself to feel before he was tired of being angry. Not because anger was wrong, but because it had stopped serving him. It had protected him once. It had signaled something important. But now, it was just repeating itself, asking for energy he didn't have. He placed his feet flat on the floor and let his hands rest open on his thighs. The room felt larger somehow. Or maybe he felt less crowded inside it. He thought about tomorrow, about what he might say or not say, about boundaries that didn't need speeches, about distance that didn't require hostility. Those options existed now calmly, without urgency. The empty chair stayed where it was just furniture again. Wood and fabric, no story attached. He stood, turned off the lamp, and let the room go dark. The anger hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like a storm he had to stand inside. It felt more like weather that had passed through and moved on. As he lay down, he noticed how his jaw finally unclenched on its own. His shoulders settled into the mattress. His breath found a rhythm that didn't need guidance. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't something he did for the person who hurt him. It was something he allowed himself so he didn't have to keep replaying the same moment every night. He didn't need to rewrite the past. He didn't need to understand them better. He didn't need an apology to rest. He just needed to stop sitting across from an empty chair arguing with someone who wasn't there. The house stayed quiet. The night held its shape. And for the first time in a while, he let himself be held by it too. Some worries feel convincing because they're true, just not complete. That evening, the person sat at a small kitchen table with papers spread out in front of them. Not a mess, just enough to feel unfinished. A bill, a printed email, a notebook open to a page with half-written thoughts. The dishwasher hummed softly in the background, steady and patient. Nothing urgent was happening. But the mind felt busy anyway. The person picked up one sheet of paper and read it again. The same lines they had already read twice. The meaning hadn't changed, but the feeling had. Each rereading brought a slightly different concern. What if this leads to something bigger? What if I'm missing something important? What if this one detail changes everything? The mind narrowed its focus until that single paper seemed to carry the weight of the whole situation. Everything else on the table faded into the background. Overthinking often begins this way, not with imagination, but with partial information. A single angle, a single piece. The mind fills in the rest, not because it's careless, but because it wants certainty. The person leaned back slightly and noticed the chair creak. The sound cut through the mental loop just enough to create space. The eyes lifted from the paper and took in the rest of the table again. There was the notebook, the other documents, the quiet glass of water near the edge. Together they told a broader story, but the mind had been gripping only one part, insisting it represented the whole. The person remembered a story heard once long ago about a group of people trying to describe something large by touching only a small part of it. One felt something thick and solid and decided it must be a wall. Another touched something thin and flexible and argued it was a rope. Each description was accurate, just incomplete. The problem hadn't been that anyone was wrong. The problem was that everyone was certain. The person set the paper down and rubbed their forehead lightly, feeling the familiar tension there. The dishwasher finished its cycle with a soft click, and the hum stopped. Silence filled the kitchen. In that quiet, the mind tried to widen its view, but habit pulled it back to the same spot. This part matters most. This is the key. This is where things could go wrong. The person stood up and walked a few steps to the counter, placing the paper there instead. Distance helped. Not much. Just enough. From across the room, the paper looked smaller, less commanding. It hadn't changed, but the relationship to it had. The person realized how often worry worked like this. A single comment from someone else. One mistake. One unknown detail. The mind touches that piece and decides it understands the whole shape of what's coming. But life rarely arrives in pieces that small. The person returned to the table and opened the notebook, fully flipping back a few pages. Notes from earlier weeks appeared, concerns that had once felt urgent and now barely registered. Problems that had resolved quietly. Situations that had shifted without effort. Seeing them there written down softened something inside. The current worry didn't vanish, but it lost its claim to completeness. The person gathered the papers into a loose stack, not organizing them fully, just bringing them together. The action felt grounding, physical, simple. Overthinking thrives when the mind believes it's seeing everything. But most of the time, it's only touching a fragment and reacting as if it's the entire picture. The person placed the stack slightly to the side and rested both hands flat on the table. The surface was cool and solid, real. A thought passed through quieter than the others. Maybe I don't have enough information yet. And that doesn't mean something is wrong. That thought didn't demand action. It didn't offer a solution. It simply widened the space. The person stayed there for a moment longer, noticing the kitchen as a whole again, the light above the chair legs, the counter, the window reflecting the dark outside. The worry was still present, but it was no longer alone. And for now, that felt like a more honest way to see what was actually there. The person stayed in the kitchen a little longer, not because there was more to do, but because leaving felt unnecessary. The house had settled into its evening rhythm. Outside the window, a porch light across the way clicked on, casting a soft circle onto the sidewalk. The stack of papers sat quietly on the table. Together they looked manageable. Not simple, but contained. The earlier sense of urgency had thinned, replaced by something closer to curiosity. The mind still wanted clarity, but it no longer demanded certainty. The person picked up the notebook again and flipped to a blank page. Not to solve anything, just to write a few words. Short phrases, incomplete thoughts. Nothing polished. As the pen moved, it became clear how narrow the earlier focus had been. One detail had been given too much authority. The mind had treated it as a verdict rather than a piece of information. Overthinking often mistakes partial contact for full understanding. When the mind touches one aspect of a situation, it fills in the rest with fear, memory, and habit. The picture feels complete even when it isn't. The person paused, pen hovering. The hum of the refrigerator returned steady and low. The sound grounded the moment. There was no rush to finish the page, no need to decide anything tonight. Another memory surfaced, this one from a long time ago. Standing in a museum looking at a large painting up close. From inches away, all that could be seen were brush strokes, thick, uneven, almost chaotic. It was only after stepping back that the image made sense. The painting hadn't changed. The distance had. The person leaned back in the chair again, letting the pen rest on the page. The earlier worry felt similar, now too close to see clearly. Too focused on texture instead of form. Some questions don't open with more pressure. They open with more space. The person gathered the papers once more and slid them into a folder. Not to hide them, just to mark a pause. The folder was placed on the counter where it would be easy to find again tomorrow. That simple boundary felt respectful, honest. The mind tried once more to pull attention back to the same concern, but this time it didn't stick. The thought arrived, hovered, then drifted away, as if it had lost the echo it needed to stay loud. The kitchen felt larger now, not physically but perceptually. The edges of the room were clearer. The air felt easier to breathe. The person turned off the overhead light and left only a small lamp on. Shadows softened. The room no longer asked for scrutiny. The worry hadn't been disproven. It hadn't been dismissed. It had been placed among other things. And that placement changed everything. Overthinking feeds on the illusion of totality. When one piece is treated as the whole, the mind tightens. When pieces are allowed to sit beside one another, the grip loosens. The person moved through the house slowly, not tired, not energized, just present. Each step felt unremarkable, which was its own kind of relief. Before leaving the kitchen, the person glanced once more at the table where the papers had been. The space was clear now, not empty, just open. The picture wasn't complete yet, and that was okay. There would be more information, more context, more angles to consider. Life rarely reveals itself all at once. The person carried that understanding forward, not as a rule to remember, but as a quieter way of seeing. Touching only one part doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means the picture isn't finished. And for tonight, that was enough to let the mind rest where it was. They finished the last delivery right as the sky started to fade from gray into that early morning blue. Not quite sunrise, just the moment when the night finally loosened its grip. The van was quieter now. No more route alerts, no more quick stops. Only the soft sound of tires rolling over empty streets. They didn't go home right away. Instead, they turned toward a small park a few blocks off the main road, the kind of park that stayed almost empty on weekdays. A few benches, a looping path, tall trees that had been there long before any of the surrounding buildings. They parked, stepped out, and pulled their jacket tighter. The air smelled like damp earth and leaves, fresh in a way that made the lungs feel more awake. They walked slowly down the path, boots pressing into the ground, with a gentle crunch. Leaves had fallen overnight, and each step made a quiet sound like paper being folded. They liked this hour. It wasn't busy yet. No joggers, no kids, no dogs barking, just space. They had been feeling something lately that they didn't know how to name at first. A kind of dull pressure, not panic, not sadness. More like the sense that their life was small. Not in a bad way, just unnoticed. They drove around all day, dropping off packages, following directions, meeting deadlines. People opened doors, signed screens, took boxes, then moved on. Sometimes they were thanked. Sometimes they weren't. Either way, it all disappeared quickly. They had caught themselves thinking more than once. Is this it? Am I doing anything that matters? It wasn't that they wanted fame. They just wanted to feel like they had weight in the world, like their existence left something behind. They reached a stretch of path where the trees grew thicker. The light shifted under the branches, softer and darker, like stepping into another kind of room. There was one tree in particular, massive, old, with a trunk so wide it looked like it had been built rather than grown. Its bark was rough and deeply lined. Its branches spread out calmly, like it had all the time in the world. They stopped in front of it and tilted their head back. The tree didn't look impressive in a loud way. It wasn't blooming. It wasn't colorful. It was simply there. And somehow, standing near it, they felt their chest loosen a little. They remembered something they had read once, a simple fact that had felt abstract at the time. Trees make oxygen. Quietly. Constantly. Without asking to be noticed, they stood there looking up through the branches and let that sink in. The tree didn't need to do anything dramatic to be valuable. It wasn't proving itself. It was supporting life just by existing. They looked around at the other trees, the ones that lined the path, and filled the park like a slow, steady crowd. No one was applauding them. No one was taking photos. And yet the air in their lungs was clean because these trees were here. They took a deeper breath. It felt strange to realize how much they depended on something they rarely thought about. They thought about their own life again. The small things that didn't get counted. The steady reliability. The way they showed up for work even when they didn't feel like it. The way they made sure packages arrived. Medicine got delivered, little everyday needs got met. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. They started walking again, slower now. Not because they were tired, but because they didn't feel the need to rush away from this feeling. Under the trees, the world felt less demanding. They didn't feel bigger. They felt more placed. Like they belonged somewhere even without being seen. They sat down on a bench not far from the old tree, letting their body rest without checking the time. The sky had grown lighter now, a soft wash of pale color behind the branches. A bird moved somewhere above them. Leaves shifted gently as a breeze passed through. Nothing felt urgent. They thought about how rarely they allowed themselves to simply exist without measuring the moment, without asking whether it was productive or meaningful enough to justify taking up space. The forest didn't seem to worry about that. The trees weren't competing with one another. They weren't trying to stand out. Each one took what it needed, light, water, space, and gave back oxygen, shade, and quiet stability in return. That felt important. They realized that value didn't always announce itself. Some forms of worth worked slowly, invisibly sustaining things in ways that were only noticed when they were gone. They thought about how many people depended on what they did without ever knowing their name. The deliveries that kept daily life running, the consistency that others relied on without thinking twice. They had dismissed those things as ordinary. But the forest was ordinary too. And still, it kept the world alive. They closed their eyes for a moment and breathed in deeply, feeling the air fill their chest. It felt fuller, somehow richer, as if their body recognized what their mind was only beginning to accept. They didn't need to be exceptional to matter. They didn't need to leave a dramatic mark. Being steady, being present, being part of the system that allowed life to keep moving. That was enough. When they stood up, their steps felt more grounded, less rushed. The old tree remained behind them, unchanged, unbothered. As they walked back toward the van, the city was starting to wake up. A few lights flicked on. A distant engine started. They knew the day would be busy again. Packages, routes, the familiar rhythm of work. But they carried something different with them now, a quiet understanding that even if no one noticed, even if nothing about their life looked impressive from the outside, they were still contributing simply by being here. Like the forest, silent, steady, essential. Fear doesn't always show up as danger. Sometimes it shows up as offense, as the feeling that something is being done to you, that someone or something has aimed straight at your life and decided to make it harder. It was late evening in a grocery store parking lot, the kind with tall lights that buzz softly and leave long shadows between cars. A person sat in their vehicle with the engine off, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. Groceries still in the trunk because they weren't ready to go home yet. The store doors slid open and closed in the distance. A shopping cart rattled across the pavement, pushed by the wind more than by anyone's intention. Somewhere nearby, a car alarm chirped once and stopped. Nothing unusual. And yet their chest felt tight. Earlier that day, something small had happened. Not a crisis, not a disaster. Just a moment that landed wrong. A comment that felt dismissive. A delay that felt personal. A situation that made their mind say, "Of course this would happen to me." That thought had stuck. It replayed itself in different forms as the day went on. Why does this always happen? Why does it feel like I'm constantly bracing for impact, sitting there now? The parking lot felt strangely symbolic. Cars pulling in and out, people crossing paths without acknowledging one another, everyone moving according to their own needs, their own timelines. Still, the feeling remained. I've been hit. They leaned back in the seat and exhaled slowly. The windows had fogged slightly from their breath, softening the harsh white lights outside. For a moment, the world looked gentler through the glass. They remembered a story they'd once heard long ago, without paying much attention to it at the time. A simple image. A boat drifting down a river. If a boat crashes into you and no one is inside it, you don't get angry. There's no one to blame. No intention to react to. Just contact. Just movement meeting movement. But if you believe someone is steering it, if you imagine a person aiming straight at you, then anger rises instantly. Fear follows close behind. They sat with that image for a moment. What if some of what feels personal isn't? The thought didn't excuse anything. It didn't deny discomfort. It simply questioned the story being told around it. A cart rolled by again, bumping lightly into the curb. The sound was dull, harmless. No one jumped. No one reacted. They noticed how quickly the mind assigns meaning, how fast it fills in intent, how rarely it pauses to ask whether there's actually a driver behind the collision. Fear loves to personalize randomness. It whispers, "This is about you. You're being targeted. You should stay guarded." Those thoughts feel protective. They feel like awareness. But often, they just keep the body tense, waiting for the next imagined impact. The person reached for a receipt on the passenger seat, folded it absent-mindedly, then unfolded it again. A small repetitive motion, something grounding. The paper was thin, warm from the store reel in their hands. They thought about how many times they'd carried resentment longer than necessary. How often fear had disguised itself as vigilance. How exhausting it was to feel constantly braced. What if the boat is empty? Not everything that collides with you is aimed. Not every disruption carries intention. Not every delay is a message. Outside, a couple walked past, talking quietly, heads close together. Their laughter drifted briefly, then faded. Another car pulled out, tires hissing softly on the pavement. Life moving, crossing, bumping, passing. They felt something loosen just slightly. The tightness didn't disappear, but it shifted. The story around it softened. They weren't suddenly okay with everything that had happened, but they weren't gripping it as tightly either. The empty boat image stayed with them. Fear had been telling them they were under attack. Understanding suggested something simpler. Movement happens. They rested their head back against the seat and closed their eyes for a few seconds. Just enough to notice their breath. In, out. Nothing fancy. Just confirming that right now nothing else was required. When they opened their eyes again, the parking lot looked the same. Lights buzzing, carts rattling, cars idling. But the feeling inside had changed its posture. Not defensive, just present. They turned the key in the ignition. The engine started smoothly, a familiar sound, reliable. As they pulled out of the parking space, they didn't replay the moment from earlier again. Not because it was resolved, but because it no longer demanded immediate interpretation. Some things collide and move on. Some boats drift without anyone steering them, and knowing the difference changes how tightly you hold the oars. The car eased out of the parking lot and onto the street, tires rolling over pavement, still warm from the day. The radio stayed off. The silence felt intentional now, not empty. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, lighting the inside of the car for a second at a time before letting it go dark again. The moment from earlier tried to return the way these things do. A sentence replayed, a look that felt dismissive, the old familiar tightening ready to defend. But something was different this time. The image of the empty boat stayed in front of it like a filter. The thought arrived, but it didn't land the same way. Instead of spiraling into, "Why does this always happen?" the mind paused on a simpler question. Was anyone steering? They noticed how often fear assumes intention, how quickly it fills the gap between event and emotion with a story about being targeted, overlooked, or attacked. That story feels urgent, protective, necessary. But stories have weight. They require energy to carry. And once you're carrying them, everything feels heavier. They stopped at a red light. The car idled quietly. Somewhere to the right, music thumped faintly from another vehicle. A different rhythm, a different evening intersecting with theirs for a moment and then moving on. The light changed. They continued. Life, they realized, is full of contact without coordination. People brushing past each other's days, each carrying their own worries, their own momentum. Collisions happen not because of malice, but because paths cross. That understanding didn't erase hurt. It just made it smaller, more proportional, easier to set down. They thought about how often fear had turned inconvenience into insult, delay into rejection, neutral silence into judgment, and how exhausting that had been. The road curved gently through a residential area. Houses stood close together, lights on in some windows, off in others, curtains drawn, dogs barking briefly, then quieting again. They passed a stop sign and slowed almost automatically. The body knows these patterns well. It doesn't question every instruction. It trusts the flow of movement it has learned. What if the mind could do that too? Trust that not every jolt requires a story. Trust that not every bump needs a conclusion. They turned onto their street. The familiar trees arched overhead, leaves catching the glow of the lamps. The neighborhood felt unchanged, steady, uninterested in the drama of the day. They parked and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deep, but not heavy. The kind of silence that lets thoughts finish themselves. Sitting there, they noticed the absence of something. The constant bracing had eased. The readiness to react had softened. Fear hadn't vanished. It rarely does. But it had lost its sharp edge. Without the story of intention, it didn't know where to stand. They gathered their things and stepped out of the car. Cool air met their face. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler clicked on spraying water in a slow, predictable arc. An empty motion. No message. Just function. They walked toward the house, groceries still waiting in the trunk. That could be dealt with later. Tonight didn't need to be efficient. As they unlocked the door, the thought returned one last time, quieter now. Maybe not everything is about you. Maybe that's not a loss. Inside the house greeted them with stillness. No urgency, no demands, just space. They set their keys down and took a breath, feeling the day release its grip. The empty boat drifted on, carrying nothing that needed to be carried. And for the first time in a while, They let it pass without reaching for the oars. They had always thought of forgiveness as something that happened between people. A conversation, an apology. A moment where someone finally understood what they had done. Without that, forgiveness felt incomplete, almost dishonest. But tonight, no one else was here. They were standing in the hallway of their apartment, lights, low shoes, still on coat, not yet hung up. The day had followed them home the way it sometimes did, slipping inside before they could shut the door. The air felt heavy, like the space had been waiting for their mood. On the small table by the wall sat a bowl with keys in it. House keys, car keys, a spare key they'd never gotten around to returning. Metal touching metal. A quiet, familiar sound when they dropped their own keys in and heard them settle. They paused there longer than necessary, fingers still resting on the edge of the bowl. Earlier, something had happened that reopened an old anger. Not a new wound, an old one. The kind you think has healed until something brushes against it the wrong way. A comment, a look. A reminder that some people never acknowledge the damage they cause. The anger hadn't exploded. It had locked in. Now it sat inside them like a closed door, solid, unmoving, keeping something in or maybe keeping something out. They couldn't quite tell anymore. They kicked off their shoes and walked into the living room without turning on the overhead light. Just the small lamp by the couch. The room felt narrow tonight, like the walls were closer than usual. Not because the space had changed, but because they were carrying something bulky inside. They sat down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Their jaw was tight, their breath shallow. It felt like being stuck in a place with no windows. They thought about the person they were angry with, not vividly, just the outline, the shape of the problem, the history that didn't need to be replayed in detail to still hurt. They noticed how often their mind returned to the same question. When will they finally admit it? When will they see what they did? When will they take responsibility? When will they say the words that would make all of this easier to carry? The answer, quietly and honestly, was one they didn't like. Maybe never. That thought landed heavier than the anger itself. They sat up and rubbed their face with both hands, palms pressing into tired eyes. It felt unfair, like losing twice. First the harm, then the silence afterward. Their gaze drifted back to the hallway table, to the bowl of keys. They stood, walked over, and picked up the spare key, the one that didn't really belong to anything anymore. They turned it between their fingers, feeling its weight. It struck them then how strange keys are. So small, so ordinary. And yet, they decide where you can go, what stays locked, what opens, what you're allowed to leave behind. They'd been holding on to this anger like a key, or maybe like a lock. It had felt protective at first. As long as they stayed angry, they didn't have to risk being hurt again. As long as the door stayed closed, nothing unexpected could get in. But standing there now, they realized something uncomfortable. They were also locked inside. The anger hadn't just kept the other person out. It had narrowed their own world, made everything feel heavier, smaller. like living in a room where the door never opened, even for fresh air. They hadn't noticed how long they'd been living that way. They sat back down, the spare key resting in their palm. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the other room. A normal sound. A grounding sound. They didn't feel generous. They didn't feel forgiving. They still felt wronged. Still felt justified. But another feeling had joined those: exhaustion. They were tired of carrying this. Tired of replaying conversations that would never finish. Tired of waiting for someone else to hand them peace. They looked at the key again, not as a symbol, just as an object. Something that could turn one way or the other. What if forgiveness wasn't about opening the door for the other person? What if it was about unlocking the door from the inside? That thought didn't bring relief right away. It brought resistance, skepticism, a tight pull in the chest that said, if I let this go, they win. But sitting with it longer, they saw that no one was winning right now. Everyone had already moved on, except them. The door had stayed closed long after the danger had passed. They didn't turn the key yet. They didn't have to. Just holding it was enough for tonight. They placed it back in the bowl, gently, as if it were something fragile. The metal clink sounded softer than before. The room didn't magically expand. The anger didn't disappear. But the air felt a little less stale. They stood there for a moment, breathing, not making any promises. Just noticing that the door inside them didn't have to stay locked forever. They didn't expect anything dramatic to happen next. No sudden release. No wave of compassion. The anger was still there when they woke up the following morning, sitting in the body, the same way a locked muscle sits, quiet but restrictive. The apartment looked ordinary in the daylight. The hallway table, the bowl of keys, the door that opened and closed like it always had. Nothing about the space suggested imprisonment. And yet they could still feel it. That inner narrowing. That sense of being stuck in a conversation that never ended. Later that day, they went out to run errands. Grocery store, pharmacy. A short walk around the block. Normal life moving at a normal pace. But every so often the old thought returned, slipping in between tasks like it had a right to be there. They should have known better. They never took responsibility. They got away with it. Each thought landed with the same familiar weight. Each one tightened the same place in the chest. It was clear now this wasn't about remembering. It was about holding. Back home, they set the grocery bags on the counter and paused again by the hallway table. The bowl of keys hadn't moved. The spare key still rested on top, slightly apart from the others. They picked it up again. This time they noticed something new. The key wasn't sharp. It wasn't heavy. It didn't demand anything. It was just a piece of metal shaped to fit one lock in the world. And right now, it wasn't even attached to anything useful. They turned it over in their palm and thought about how long they'd been waiting. Waiting for acknowledgement. Waiting for an apology that would make the past make sense. Waiting for the other person to finally unlock something for them. But the truth was quiet and uncomfortable. That person wasn't holding the key anymore. Maybe they never were. The lock was here, inside. They sat down on the couch, key still in hand, and let that sink in. Forgiveness, they realized, wasn't a door that swung open to let someone back in. It was a door that opened inward, just enough to let air move again. They didn't have to invite anyone through it. They closed their eyes and felt the anger directly without building a story around it. Just the sensation, the tightness, the heat, the familiar edge. It wasn't endless. It had a shape. And like most things with a shape, it could change. They imagined the door not in detail, not as a metaphor to analyze, just as a presence. Solid, closed, familiar. And then they imagined the smallest possible movement, not flinging it open, just loosening the latch. There was resistance, a reflexive fear. If I open this, I lose my protection. But another voice, quieter and steadier, answered back. You're not being protected anymore. You're being confined. They let that thought sit without arguing with it. When they opened their eyes, nothing in the room had changed. The groceries still waited to be put away. The afternoon light slanted across the floor. The world hadn't shifted to accommodate this moment. But inside, something had eased, not in a way that felt emotional, but in a way that felt practical. Like setting down a bag you'd forgotten you were carrying. They stood, walked to the hallway table, and placed the spare key back in the bowl. Not carefully this time, just normally. The sound it made was unremarkable. And that was the point. They weren't performing forgiveness. They weren't declaring it. They weren't forgiving for anyone else. They were simply choosing not to keep themselves locked in the same small room. The anger didn't vanish. It didn't need to. It just stopped deciding everything. Later that evening, as the sky dimmed and the apartment grew quiet again, they noticed how different the space felt. Not brighter, not happier, just less tight. Like the walls had shifted back to where they belonged. They thought briefly about the person they'd been angry with. Not with warmth, not with bitterness either. Just acknowledgement. This happened. It hurt. And I don't need to carry it forever. That was enough. They turned off the lights one by one and let the apartment settle into darkness. The door inside them wasn't wide open. It didn't have to be. It was unlocked. And that was already a kind of freedom. Some problems don't tighten all at once. They tighten slowly the more you pull at them. That night, the person stood in a small laundry room folding clothes straight from the dryer. The machine had just finished its cycle, releasing a burst of warm air and the faint smell of clean cotton. The room was narrow, functional. The kind of place meant for small, repetitive tasks. One sleeve, one sock, one familiar motion after another. At the bottom of the dryer drum, a long drawstring lay tangled around itself. It belonged to a hoodie, thin and flexible, twisted into a tight knot near the end. The person picked it up, already feeling a trace of irritation rise. Of course. Why does this always happen? The knot didn't look complicated at first, just a loop pulled through another loop. something that should come apart easily if handled the right way. The person pinched one end and tugged gently. The knot resisted. A little more force followed. The string stretched. The knot tightened slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to change its shape. The person frowned, focusing more closely now. Overthinking often begins here, not with panic, but with effort. The belief that a small problem will respond to just a bit more pressure. The person pulled again, this time from the other side. The knot shifted, but didn't loosen. Instead, it became denser, the loops pressing into each other like they were trying to disappear. The dryer clicked softly as it cooled. Silence filled the room. The person felt the familiar tension in their shoulders, the same tension that appeared earlier that day during a conversation that went nowhere, an email that seemed impossible to word correctly, a decision that refused to feel settled. Why is this not working? It should be simple. The drawstring twisted further as the person tried a different angle, fingers moving faster now. The knot responded by becoming smaller, tighter, more stubborn. The person paused, breath held for a moment longer than usual. This felt familiar too. There are moments when effort becomes the problem, when the very act of trying to fix something makes it worse. Overthinking lives comfortably in this space, where every attempt to resolve creates more complexity. The person dropped the drawstring onto the counter and rested their hands there, palms flat. The surface was cool grounding. The knot stayed where it was unchanged. The mind, however, kept pulling. What if I leave it like this? What if it gets worse? I should figure this out now. The urge to act felt urgent, even though nothing depended on it. The hoodie would still be wearable. The night wouldn't collapse if the knot stayed tied. Still, the discomfort lingered. The person picked up the string again, but this time noticed something different. The knot wasn't aggressive. It wasn't resisting out of defiance. It was simply responding to the direction of force. Pulling tightened it. Twisting confused it. Speed worked against it. The person slowed down, not as a strategy, just because the fingers were tired. Holding the knot gently, they rotated it slightly, not pulling, just looking. The shape revealed itself gradually, how one loop passed under another, how the tension traveled along the string. Nothing loosened yet, but nothing tightened either. That felt new. The laundry room remained quiet. The rest of the clothes waited patiently on the counter, unaffected by this small struggle. The world outside didn't know or care about the knot. The person exhaled, realizing they had been holding their breath again. Overthinking often convinces us that urgency equals importance. That if we don't solve something immediately, we're failing at something unseen. But here, with the knot resting in the palm of the hand, urgency lost its credibility. The person set the drawstring down once more and folded a towel instead. The motion was automatic, familiar. It didn't require problem solving. As the towel was smoothed and stacked, the shoulders relaxed without instruction. The knot was still there when the person returned to it. No worse, no better, just unchanged. That alone felt like a quiet correction. Not everything tightens if left alone. Some things only tighten when pulled. The person picked up the drawstring again this time, with less intention to win and more willingness to see. The fingers moved slower, separating one small loop from another, testing space instead of force. The knot didn't come undone yet, but for the first time, it stopped getting tighter. And that was enough to change how the moment felt. The knot rested quietly in the person's hand. It no longer felt like an enemy, just a small problem waiting without urgency. The laundry room light hummed softly overhead, and the folded clothes formed a neat stack beside the dryer. The person turned the drawstring slowly, letting it hang between two fingers. Without pulling, the loops began to show their structure. One crossed under another. One end had been pulled through at an angle that made everything look more complicated than it was. The mind noticed the same pattern it often fell into, trying to force clarity instead of allowing it. Overthinking doesn't always feel frantic. Sometimes it feels precise, controlled, as if tightening the grip will bring order. But the knot offered a different response. Every sharp movement made it worse. Every pause made it more workable. The person placed the knot down on the counter and stepped back half a pace. That small distance mattered. It broke the sense of pressure. It gave the eyes a chance to see the whole thing, instead of just the tight center. The memory of the day returned again. A moment where words had been chosen too quickly. A reaction that had closed a conversation instead of opening it. The urge to replay it had been strong, almost automatic. But replaying had tightened it too. The person picked up the drawstring again this time, holding it loosely, allowing gravity to help. One end dropped slightly, and the knot shifted. A tiny opening appeared, not enough to undo it, but enough to show possibility. That was all it took. The fingers moved carefully now, not trying to solve the whole thing at once. Just easing one loop, creating a bit of space, letting tension move instead of trapping it. The knot loosened almost on its own. There was no sudden release, no satisfying snap, just a gradual softening until the loops separated and the drawstring fell straight again, simple and unremarkable. The person noticed the relief not in the hands, but in the chest. That felt familiar too. So many worries work the same way. They tighten when we panic. They harden when we demand immediate answers. They stay tangled when we keep pulling at them from the same angle. The person laid the hoodie on top of the folded clothes, the drawstring now resting easily along the fabric. The problem had been resolved, but not through effort, through patience. The mind recognized something without needing to turn it into a rule space helps. Slowness helps. Not every knot responds to strength. The laundry room felt quieter now, even though nothing about it had changed. The machine was off. The light remained the same. The stack of clothes waited to be put away. The difference was internal. The person carried the clothes down the hallway, noticing how the body moved more freely. The shoulders no longer braced. The steps felt lighter. The earlier worries hadn't disappeared. They would likely return later in another form, another setting. That wasn't a failure. It was just how the mind worked. But now, there was a reference point. When thoughts begin to tighten, pulling harder isn't always the answer. Sometimes the most effective response is to stop pulling at all, to step back, to create space, to let the structure reveal itself. The person placed the folded clothes in a drawer and closed it gently. The sound was soft, final, without force. The knot was gone. Not because it had been defeated, but because it had been allowed to loosen. And the rest of the evening continued without adding anything extra. That was enough. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.